Today on Ministry Monday, I'm talking to Tony Alonso. Hi, Tony. How are you?
Hey Amanda, I'm great. Good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today on Ministry Monday for part three of our Exsultet conversation. So before we get into the meat of what we're going to talk about, what have you been up to lately? I can't believe it, but you and I were just talking before we started recording that it's been 2 years since we last spoke on the podcast. We had talked about your album Caminemos con Jesus, which has been 2 years, and yet it feels like 7 years since I last talked to you. So what have you been up to?
Yes, it was a long 2 years. The world kind of rapidly changed soon after we talked.
Right.
This year, I'm a professor at Emory University here in Atlanta, Candler School of Theology, and I'm the director of the Catholic Studies program. But this year I'm actually on research leave, which means I have an entire year to wake up every morning and write and or think about and or agonize about writing. So pretty much most of my days are consumed with research and writing this entire academic year. It's been a real gift and a challenge. But as signs of spring, both in the season, but also in the world are showing, it's kind of exciting to think about getting back to, meeting in person with NPM this summer. RE Congress in Los Angeles is coming up in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
So yeah, so I'm looking forward to connecting with a lot of people. It helped me realize this time of isolation, like how much I, treasure the kind of relationships that we have in these communities. And I'm excited to reconnect with people.
I am too. I am too, for the same reason. And I am also excited in a similar reason for Triduum this year and Lent in general, because, I think about the last two Lenten seasons and not to focus on 2020, because I know everyone that's listening has focused on 2020 for 2 years, but there has been such a shift for the last two Lenten seasons that I really am looking forward to journeying in this Lenten journey with a fuller congregation than maybe some of us have. This time last year, vaccinations were not fully, available yet to the public. So it's a different Lent. And so I'm looking forward to taking the time to examine our journey together and to look at what is best so that we can offer the best opportunity for full, active, and conscious participation from all that are gathered this year. I think it's going to be not a joyful Lent, as
Yeah.
Father Paul Turner would say, it's a miserable Lent, but it's a renewing Lent, a very, introspective Lent for me.
Yeah, it feels like a necessary Lent. Like, yeah, exactly right.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. So, for the last 2 weeks, like I mentioned, we've been talking about the Exultet. The first week, we spoke with Father Paul Turner about the historical context. Last week, we spoke with Nicholas Will, who talked about learning the Exultet, especially if you don't have a musical background. Today, we're going to take it one step further and look at bilingual considerations for the Exultet. So, let's just start right from the beginning, Tony. What are some of the practical considerations for a bilingual parish when it comes to the Exultet?
Well, first, let me say, I just love that we're geeking out about the Exultet for 3 whole Ministry Mondays episodes. That's just incredible. And I'm glad to be geeking out with you about it.
Thank you.
Um, in terms of thinking about the practical considerations of proclaiming the bilingual Exultet, I think it's important to note, like, right off the bat, that even preparing the Exultet in a single language is just a ton of work. It requires an incredible amount of care and preparation. It's one of the most ancient hymns of the church and also one of the longest. And so it's really something to start thinking about practicing and praying weeks. And that's why I appreciate that you're starting this now, or even months before you actually are going to do it. And I know whenever I've had the privilege of proclaiming the Exultet, I sense the weight of that responsibility. And for a bilingual community, it's even more weighty and it's even more tricky. There are lots of very basic questions. Are we going to proclaim it in a single language? If so, how do we decide which of the languages we're going to proclaim it in? Are we going to proclaim it in more than one language? And if we do that, how are we going to split it up? What's permitted? What's not permitted? What makes sense? And then, of course, who is going to proclaim this? Because as you know, it's hard enough to find someone who has the abilities and stamina to pray it in one language. If you're going to do it in two, like, who's going to do that? And I
Right.
think who is proclaiming it also communicates a lot to a diverse community. And then perhaps most importantly, how will this entire assembly of diverse people hear themselves, see themselves, experience their relationship with God in this prayer that's at the heart of the year? So I think there are very practical questions and basic questions, but they also like contain multitudes.
I agree. I agree. So we've talked about the practical considerations for one language, which we've actually kind of explored, for 2 weeks now. And now we're looking at encompassing and welcoming and embodying a community that speaks so many different languages and just comes from so many different cultural backgrounds. So, what would be, in your opinion, the best solution to offer for the Exsultet in one language, or splitting it into alternating linguistic phrases? Now, I know that's kind of a loaded question when I say that, because every parish is different. You have to do what's best. But in your experience, in your opinion, what would you recommend as a solution?
Yeah, I'll echo you and say that I don't think it's a black and white answer. And also, it will save me from being, challenged too much on the blogs if I say everybody should make up their own mind. But I think that so much that happens during the 3 days in a bilingual parish really does require the specific pastoral expertise, sensitivity, and discernment of the leaders of a particular community. And each parish has its own realities. And I really do believe that. So I'll speak to my reality and kind of let you listen in on that reality. And maybe that'll help people in their own discernment of their community. So, like many parishes in the US, my parish here in Atlanta for a very long time was an almost exclusively English praying parish. But in the last couple of decades, we've seen a huge influx of Latino Catholics. At the last several Easter vigils, I would say that about 80% or so of the people we've initiated are Latino, Latina.
Wow.
So, and we initiate a lot of people. I mean, the Archdiocese of Atlanta is really a growing place. So, even though the long ethos of the parish is one thing, the present reality is another, and it's constantly shifting. So it's hard for me to imagine looking out at the community gathered for the vigil at my parish and chant such an important prayer only in English, when so many of the people that are going to be received that night into this church and their families are primarily Spanish speakers. There would be a kind of a disjoint there, a disconnect. But likewise, it's hard for me to imagine praying it completely in English, because about half the assembly or so, less and less, but still about half are primarily English speakers. And I'd also add, not everybody that's Latino, Latina speaks Spanish, and not everyone that's Latino, Latina feels most comfortable in Spanish. So there's all kinds of complex realities. But whatever the case, I think for me, the reality is that thoughtfully alternating phrases or long portions of the Exsultet makes most sense for our community. And there's no exact way to do this, right? Like there's no prohibition that I'm aware of doing this, but there's also no explicit permission for it, right? Like so many of things we do in multilingual liturgy, bilingual liturgy, there's no multilingual Roman Missal. There's the Roman
Right.
Missal in all these languages. So you really have to do the discernment with care. So there's no exact way of doing it. I have spent a lot of time over the years thinking about what makes logical sense, what flows linguistically, and what flows musically, so that the entire community is getting some sense of what's being prayed. And again, that's not a black and white answer, but I spent a lot of time thinking about that when I approached the Exsultet text. And it's worked well for us in my community. I mean, I can honestly say that no one at my parish has ever, at least to me, and people are not shy to express their musical opinions, as pastoral musicians know,
That's correct.
has ever expressed a desire that they would only hear it in one language. I mean, it's almost like it's become part of the texture of the way our community hears the Exsultet. Like, I don't think people could imagine it another way. But I think it's taken a long time to get there, and a great amount of care in how we piece it together to get to that point.
Can you share a little bit of how you did piece it together to get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I've been proclaiming the Exsultet and/or preparing others to proclaim it in bilingual communities for a long time. The first church that I was the full-time music minister at in Evanston was kind of my baptism into, pardon the pun, into the bilingual triduum. Even though my father is Cuban and my mother is Minnesotan, we primarily worshipped in English growing up, save
Mhm.
when we would visit my grandparents in Miami. So my experience of the vigil up to that point was pretty much only in English. And so to hear the kind of blending of languages really was exciting for me. I mean, it felt like coming home in a way to something I had never been to, but it was like, yes, this is me. Um, so I spent a lot of time, with the text. I mean, there's really no science to it, right? It's like it's not that different actually than composing. I mean, except it's a pre-existing thing. I would spend a lot of time singing, breaking it up in different ways. And sometimes it would feel like, no, if this text goes on for this long in this language, they're going to totally miss the sentiment of this section, right? So it's a kind of being attentive to the various sections and making sure that everybody's kind of being able to listen in and understand particular phrases and words. I think, one thing that has kind of remained constant is there's that whole almost like a litaniaic part in the Exsultet of this is the night, esta es la noche, esta es la noche. And that to me like almost calls out for a back and forth between the languages. So there are
Mhm.
some parts that to me kind of like call out for a particular approach. Other parts are really tricky. I've recently been revisiting this for a project I've been working on and really thinking through, okay, like really, why did you choose to proclaim this in English and that in Spanish? Is a challenge, right? But I think mainly that my primary driving force, probably in all of my liturgical music, but including especially the Exsultet, is the text and making sure that the fullness of the prayer is somehow heard, even if you only understand the English or you only understand the Spanish.
Okay. So we've talked about, of course, the context of making sure that in a bilingual community, both segments or fractions of those who understand Spanish or English feel welcomed, included, and like you said, they really understand and feel that depth of the text. Let's shift it a little bit. And let's talk about best representing the Misal Romano. So, how, if we were in a Spanish speaking only community or we wanted to just proclaim the Exultet in Spanish, how do we best represent the Misal Romano Spanish only Exultet?
Yeah. I don't think that there's any particular way to represent the Spanish that's necessarily different than how one would prepare the English. I think that careful preparation in any language is just essential. And that preparation, of course, isn't just about learning the words and the notes, but praying with the words, paying attention to the structure, practicing conveying the depth of the text. I mean, these are some of the conversations you've been having in previous episodes. So I don't mean to sound redundant, but in a way, I don't think there's a big difference in how that's proclaimed. I mean, when you start to think about what setting to use, and I'll show my cards that I prefer the chant. Even though I myself have composed a setting, at least in English, of the Exultet for communities that want something accompanied and whatnot. I still prefer the chant. And I think as far as preparing that chant in English or in Spanish, I haven't found a big difference. I find it a difference when I proclaim it bilingually, because there's something about having to switch between the two. But the preparation to me remains the same in both.
Are there any cultural considerations that we need to be aware of or be cognizant of when preparing the Exultet in Spanish only?
So I'll mention like a seemingly straightforward one, and probably you and some of your listeners will go like, "Well, of course." And that's if it's going to be proclaimed in Spanish only in a bilingual community, let it be proclaimed by a Spanish speaker. And I know this sounds basic, but sometimes it feels like in these huge moments of the liturgical year, where kind of like the longer history of the church has been largely English speakers, these major musical moments are sometimes given to like a well-known cantor in the community, right? Like this is a big
Right.
musical moment, so we have to give it to so and so, even if it's not their primary language. And I think that's one way that it can go really wrong. Um, and I think it's really important textually that it's not, ideally, not a Spanish as a second language cantor, even, Or if it is, and I have to say, I have had some fantastic cantors who really know Spanish very well, and they've done beautifully with it. They really need to be comfortable inhabiting the language, because it's not like singing a verse of the communion song in Spanish, right?
Right,
Uh,
right.
and I don't like. I mean, I really do appreciate when people who are not primarily Spanish speakers take the risk of trying a verse in Spanish, and vice versa. I think that's beautiful. I think the Exultet is one of those prayers, though, that it's really for the advanced placement crew linguistically, right? And so that's one thing I would say. But I think another, is just being attentive to who's in front of you. What's their story? What's the story of this place? For me, the way in which I chant the Exultet, no matter how much I prepare, uh, being in front of these people in this place at this time really shapes how ultimately I'm going to sing that. So I do spend a lot of time in my preparation thinking about that. And like I say, in our community, like so many of the people being initiated are Latino, Latina. So I'm constantly thinking about them and praying for and with them when I'm preparing.
Especially because, too, I have always looked with a special level of affection for those who are in our CIA about to be initiated and welcomed fully into the church on that Easter Vigil, because there is something I have seen about that extra glow of their faces underneath the candles as they're experiencing Easter Vigil, because Easter Vigil is a special, special liturgy. There's nothing else like it, in my opinion, throughout the year. It's so unique. And it really is so joyful to watch the RCIA candidates experience it too, with them also knowing that they're about to go through the final stages of their initiation into the church.
Yeah, I think about that too. Like some years when it's really cold, I don't want to go outside before I have to sing for 12 minutes. But I always do, because I just I can't imagine not being out there around the fire with the catechumens, candidates, and just kind of that whole beginning of the liturgy, the procession in, shapes so much of how I ultimately proclaim that Exultet, that I can't bring myself to just kind of be waiting inside. That I feel you on that.
Absolutely. So, are there any other things you'd like to mention in regards to the Exultet?
I mean, I could talk about the Exultet all day, but a couple thoughts. Sometimes when people talk about doing something bilingually, there's a lot of talk of sacrifice, right? Like, well, I didn't understand everything because I don't speak that language, and it's true. I mean, when you do multilingual liturgy, bilingual liturgy, often like everybody is being asked to give up something that they would prefer.
Hmm.
And one of those things that they're asked to give up is total intelligibility of every prayer in their own language. And that's a big deal, right? Like that matters. But I think there are, of course, I mean, a side note is, of course, I think there's so much more to be gained by giving that up. And I do think, the church calls us to give up things. But I would say this, that I think the Exultet is not a prayer, even when it's proclaimed in a single language, that you're going to absorb in a hearing anyway, right? Like if when it's chanted fully in English or fully in Spanish, it's not like everybody like is going to remember that prayer. I mean, it's so dense and so rich. I mean, as a person who sings it, proclaims it year by year, I know that every year I am like discovering something new about the text. So it's good to remember that it's not about just like a didactic, proclamation of the text so people intellectually know it, right? And so I think that one of the things that I would love to see more of, is more preaching on the Exultet. I think it's a beautiful source for preaching, both at the vigil, but throughout the entire Easter season. I mean, there is stuff in there that, I mean, you could preach the entire Easter season. You could weave in the Exultet. I know in other songs that I've written for the Easter season, I weave in phrases of the Exultet because they beautifully communicate the fullness of the season. And I also think then that's another way to help the assembly who may not have caught portions of it in their own language unfold the fullness of the meaning. So I think catechesis, and preaching is a huge thing that people don't appreciate about the Exultet. And because it's only proclaimed once a year, I really wish people would take up that invitation. There's so much richness. Um, In terms of the preparation, this isn't particular to Spanish and bilingual liturgy, but I'll say that I really think it's important to practice in the space. I have a practice every Easter Saturday when the church is being kind of either decorated
Right.
for the vigil, adorned for the vigil, or when it's empty. Ideally, I prefer it when it's empty, of just practicing in the space. And then the other thing is, a basic tip: don't forget to practice in the dark. Because I have had experiences, even though there's a Paschal candle and perhaps other minimal light. I have had experiences in churches where there is a lot of light, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I never really thought about this until this moment before I'm about to launch into this. Really think through the lighting so you don't have the panic attack that I have had at times. But most of all, I just think, if you're called upon, or should I say invited to proclaim the Exsultet, like it's such an incredible blessing and honor. Like, take it seriously and take your time with it. Don't dust that thing off on the Wednesday before. Pray with it, pray with the words, and don't just pray with it in terms of your own personal prayer life. That's important. But like, what is this assembly this year need to hear about this, and how am I going to make that come alive? And as we started this conversation, thinking about kind of like this is going to be our first, fullish triduum in a couple of years, in
Right.
light of the last couple, what do people need to hear? I mean, there's a lot of phrases in there, a lot of beauty in there, a lot of challenge in there that our communities need to hear. And so I think sitting with that, in many ways, it's like a preacher sitting with the scriptures, because when you proclaim that thing, the way you proclaim certain phrases is a kind of preaching.
Absolutely. And I really do think, like you said, there's such beauty in it that, like you said, I mean, I think 3 episodes isn't even enough to cover everything on the Exultet. But again, that's just me. I've always found the Exultet to be such a beautiful, unique part because, and this is my cynicism playing through, but when else do we have a captive audience with hot molten wax in their hands if they're holding candles, and they stay still and are so engrossed in like 9 minutes of chant that they only hear once a year? I mean, really, there's something to me that's so
And
magnetic.
standing.
And standing, it's standing for 9 minutes. I mean, really, it's, to me,
What? A
it's
lot of
beautiful.
pressure.
It is a lot of pressure. Well, before we wrap up today, I do have a question similar to this. You have actually recently published something with the GIA called Gloriosi, and I think it would tie in so well. So, can you kind of share a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. So pretty much from my first ministry experience as a full-time music minister that I mentioned earlier in Evanston, I have celebrated the Triduum bilingually. And I was surprised when I first went to do it, how kind of homespun everything was. Like, people writing in translations of verses, and like, old Xerox copies of this and that, and this refrain. And there was something beautiful about it, but I was surprised that there was not some kind of comprehensive resource,
Right.
because, in the last 10, 20 years, I mean, so many parishes celebrate the Triduum bilingually. And so ever since then, I've kind of been searching, like, this has to be out there, right? Someone's done this. And like so many of my projects, it's kind of like, I would say the vast majority of the liturgical music projects I've done have started with me saying like, gosh, I hope someone's done this. And then I go looking for it. And then I'm surprised that it hasn't been done. I'm like, well, I guess the ball's in my hand. And so I've always wanted this project. And then slowly decided I wanted to do this project, but it's enormously challenging. I mean, a comprehensive Triduum resource, I don't even know if one exists completely in English, to be honest with you. I mean, other than if you look just like the Roman Missal chants as a
Right.
cohesive thing. Maybe it does, I don't know, but nothing bilingually. And so, like 40 discrete pieces of music. And then thinking about like how to represent two languages, it's just an enormous amount of work. So I've been wanting to do it basically for 20 years. And it really represents my this isn't like a project I started 2 years ago and said, I'm going to do this bilingual Triduum project. I mean, it's kind of been like slowly in the works, born of my own needs over time. At my church in Atlanta, I feel like every year it's like, I don't know that that psalm's quite the right setting for us. So I'll write a new one and I'll ask my music minister if we can try it out, and we will, and I'll make tweaks. And so it all culminated finally in this project called Gloriosi, which is a completely comprehensive collection of music for the bilingual Triduum. I'm really excited about it. I don't expect that, people are going to buy it and use every single piece for their Triduum. People have their beloved pieces, but I really wanted to represent the whole thing. So like everything is there for those, who need it.
Wow, that's great. And it's available now, correct?
It's available, yeah, as of like 2 weeks ago.
Excellent. Oh, well, first off, congratulations on that huge, huge goal, huge accomplishment. If I remember correctly, you are going to be talking about this topic at the NPM convention this year. Is that correct?
I am. I don't know what the terminology is these days, but I think it is the word mega. Is there a word?
I do believe so. Yes, I'm quietly pulling out my convention brochure right here. And to my knowledge, you were doing 2 mega breakouts, which just
That's
means
it.
that they're extended in duration, about this exact topic. They are called We Should Glory in the Cross, preparing the bilingual Triduum with style and grace.
Yes, yes. I'm really looking forward to that, because I know that people who take on this work of preparing a bilingual Triduum, like they really do want to do it well, and there aren't always the resources out there to support it. And so I'm anxious to help think through this with people and share some of the new music and yeah, help people prepare these with style and grace.
I think this is such an important topic. It really is, because first off, I mean, Lenten Triduum is such an anchor of what we believe in Christianity and Catholicism. And to, again, like you've spoken many times before, I've heard you discuss, it is so crucial in our work to truly do the work that represents those who sit at the table, really. And so I think this work is so important, and I thank you for doing it.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for NPM's support of my work and our work, and great to be back on Ministry Mondays. And hopefully, we're on the upswing of the world
I
rather than the
know.
downswing like last time.
I know. I know. It is insane to think that the last time we spoke, we were 2 or 3 weeks away from our worlds completely changing. But I hope that you have I don't want to say a normal Lent, because again, that's not the right type of mentality, but I hope that you find moments again of prayerfulness and renewal and contemplation, so that you can, as a musician and as a person of the church, help bring other people there too.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Appreciate it.